Welcome to the France 24 debate. Cuba prepares its change of leadership and the post-Castro era is being hailed. But will this be change Cubans can believe in, or will it be more of the same? Well, our guests to discuss Cuba without a Castro, a new country perhaps on the horizon. By Skype, we're joined from Miami, Florida by John Suarez, human rights activist, Center for Free Cuba. Thank you, sir, for being with us. By satellite from Chicago, Illinois, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, lecturer at Northwestern University, Latin American director, Green Mantle Organization. Thank you, sir, for joining us. By Skype from Dublin, Brett Bruin, Director of Global Engagement for the Obama Administration. Thank you, sir, for being with us. And President at Global Situation Room. And by satellite from Havana, Cuba, we're going to be joined pretty shortly by Carlos Alzogade, who's a Cuban diplomat and former ambassador of the Cuban mission to the European Union. But before hearing from our guests, and they have things to say, let me assure you, let's take a look at what's happening now in Cuba.
A breeze of change in Cuba, with Raul Castro set to relinquish the presidency after he and his brother were at the helm for nearly 6 decades. Castro's protege, Miguel Diaz-Canel, and current vice president since 2013, is expected to follow in his footsteps. Born in central Cuba soon after the revolution, the 57-year-old was well-groomed as a consummate Communist Party insider. He's held various local positions. In 2013, with Raul Castro's support, he joined the party's powerful political bureau, and in 2009 became Minister of Higher Education. Even though he's been a public official for more than a decade, not much is known about him.
He has preferred to be in the shadows, which is not surprising in many ways. That was also the characteristic that Raul Castro had during the time that he was the vice president. The first challenge for the future president will be to stabilize the country's economy that continues to be fragile, despite the recent openings to the international market.
He'll find a country in a difficult situation, with a growth rate that for the last 5 years isn't high, far from what the goal actually was. A country that, without doubt, still has strong financial restrictions, and one that also has to deal with the grip from North American sanctions.
Donald Trump brought to a halt recent U.S. overtures towards Cuba. Reforms in the country are also on hold, and few expect significant changes.
Raul isn't leaving. Everyone here knows that in every country there's always a supervisor. In between those who come in, Raul stays. The Castros remain. There is no change.
Even at the age of 86, Castro will retain a pivotal role. He will remain the head of the all-powerful Cuban Communist Party until its next Congress in 2021.
Sets us up to discuss what happens next in Cuba. Let's bring in first for comment John Suarez, human rights activist at Center for Free Cuba. John, thanks for being with us. We'll get to our other guests as soon as we can. And of course, all feel free to join in whenever you like. But let's get an opening comment from each of you. John, in terms of what's happening now, what's going to happen next, what are your feelings about it?
Oh, what I think is that first and foremost, Miguel Diaz-Canel is going to be president, as Osvaldo Dorticos was from 1959 to 1976. That did not deter Fidel and Raul Castro from running the regime in Cuba as an absolute dictatorship. And I expect the same with Mr. Canel. Lamentably, the human rights situation in Cuba has not changed. The ladies in white continue to be beaten every Sunday. People like Eduardo Cardet, the head of the Christian Liberation Movement, is an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience who was nearly stabbed to death in December of 2017 and remains in prison today, serving an unjust prison sentence. So, frankly, I don't see much in the way of change.
In terms of the nuance that we might see, I mean, clearly with the warming up of relations with the US, with the ability to travel now, with perhaps an easing of trade, do you see anything happening there?
Well, I think that the ability of Cubans to travel is something that could be taken back at any time. It's a privilege that's been provided by the regime in their legislation, not a right. Osvaldo Payá Sardiñas, who described this as a fraudulent change or a fake change back in 2012, March 30th, paid with his life a few months later, precisely exposing the sham that's taking place. In terms of U.S. engagement, there's a paradox. The highest level of trade between Cuba and the United States was not during the Obama administration's warming with the Castro regime. It was in the last year of the Bush administration, over $700 million in trade. When Obama began in December of 2014, trade between the United States and Cuba collapsed to about $140 million for the year compared to $711 million during the Bush administration. Paradoxically, as the Trump administration has had somewhat of a turnaround, we've seen those trade numbers go up between Cuba and the United States.
John Suarez, thank you for the moment. Let's bring you from Chicago, Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, lecturer at Northwestern University, Latin American director at Greenmantle. Daniel, thank you again for being with us. Is what we're seeing in Havana right now, the assembly, the vote that's going on, is it a sham? Does it have any real meaning?
Well, I think it's more of a facelift than a downright sham. It's not something they're doing simply to go through the motions necessarily. This is a very critical time for Cuba in its history, and one that I'd venture they didn't really expect to be in. During the last 10 years, Cuba was very careful to essentially set up sort of a hedged strategy for being able to continue being the type of state that it has been for most of its recent history. The way that it did that was by basically opening up the possibility of continuing to have a state, a protector state, that could help it with infusing money, by sending oil, something that they had in the relationship with the Soviet Union, that once the Soviet Union collapsed, it created a prolonged period of famine in Cuba when the money ran out because they didn't have a local protector, essentially, or an international protector. That new protector became Venezuela, but during the time when the former President Hugo Chavez was dying, Cuba did two basically important strategic moves at right about the same time. One, they helped engineer the succession of Nicolás Maduro, the current president of Venezuela, who is a very strong Cuban ally, and who has continued to send, even as Venezuela collapses, some semblance of the oil shipments and the cash shipments that Cuba was very much dependent on and continues to be. And at the same time, they started reaching out towards their old enemy, the United States, for a rapprochement. Right now, we're having essentially a bit of a perfect storm for Cuba in which both of those strategies have become problematic because a new administration, unlike anything that's been seen in recent years in the United States, has taken over, which has made it very difficult to justify politically internally continued rapprochement on the one hand. On the other hand, Venezuela has gone from regional cautionary tale to basically regional cataclysm. And their ability to continue relying on Venezuela has basically ended. So you essentially have a perfect storm in which Cuba has to make sure that if this is a sham, if there's very little political change that's likely to take place, they have to make sure that what they are communicating to the rest of the world is that some sort of change, some sort of democratization process is in the works. Because if you can't count on Venezuela, and you may not be able to count on the United States, you need to look for other partners within the European Union, within other Latin American countries. And right now, Cuba's ability to do so, as we saw by some of the back and forth in the Summit of the Americas last week, their diplomatic strength right now is relatively low.
Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, there is much to talk about, many points there to develop. Thank you very much indeed for the moment. Let's bring in by Skype from Dublin, Brett Bruin, Director of Global Engagement for the Obama administration and currently President of Global Situation Room. Brett, thanks for being with us. You've heard what John Suarez and Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez was saying. Can I start by asking you for your take on what we're seeing right now and what's likely to happen next?
Yeah, and I have to say that I agreed largely with what Daniel's saying, with one important addition. I think Russia looms large here. Vladimir Putin has both privately and publicly expressed his interest in increasing Russian presence in the Americas, and Cuba represents an opportunity. That being said, I think what Daniel's saying with respect to needing to do more than a facelift, it has to, I think, show both to Washington as well as to Brussels and elsewhere that there are some changes underway that will at least give the new president some time, some confidence in foreign capitals to try to earn allegiance and some opportunities from governments. And I have to say, we've seen other cases where superficial change works with this White House. So I don't know that it requires a great deal of action on the part of Havana to get an olive branch extended from Washington.
Do you think the Cuban people, though, are demanding change? They want change. They want to get a better way of life. They want to have more products. They want to have the things that maybe they see and hear about.
I think they do. And I think
absolutely.
Lamentably,
and
over
this
the years,
was very much behind.
Sorry.
I think this was behind the Obama administration's take. I think Ben Rhodes, who I worked directly for, believed firmly that opening up relations between the United States and Cuba would open up opportunities to the Cuban people, and they, in turn, would push their government, would be able to push their government for greater reform.
Brett, thank you. John Suarez was trying to get in. John, go ahead.
Well, I'd say first and foremost, lamentably, it was the Obama administration that closed the door on the Cuban people. They curtailed the Cuban Adjustment Act. They curtailed the program for Cuban doctors that are basically trafficked to third-party countries where the regime is able to profit from their laborers while they live in really substandard conditions. Until January of 2017, they could, January of 2017, they could find asylum in the United States. Those programs were ended by the Obama administration as part of this engagement process, and that was not to the benefit of the Cuban people. Secondly, I don't think Cuba really was that much interested in the outreach during the Obama years. It was more the Obama administration reaching out to them. Think about this. While the U.S. was negotiating with Cuba, Cuba was caught smuggling tons of weapons to North Korea, where the shipment was intercepted in Panama. They got hold of a Hellfire missile that was used in NATO exercises and refused to give it back to the United States in private negotiations until it became public almost 2 years later in a Wall Street Journal piece. So Cuba, they would like to have sanctions lifted and have normalized relations with the U.S., but it's not their priority. Their priority is maintaining their hostile position to the U.S. Their priority is spreading revolution elsewhere, as it has in Venezuela. And when you bring up, as the former Obama administration official did, Russia's interest in the hemisphere, that started and accelerated during the, well, not started, but it intensified during the Obama administration, where we saw Russian presence in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas, having returned to power, purchased Russian tanks. And we also saw when American diplomats were meeting with their Cuban counterparts in Havana after the December 2014 announcement that Russian spy ships were there in the harbor very publicly to send a message.
Yes, the Russian-Soviet link with Cuba, of course, goes back
if I could.
many, many generations, doesn't it? Go ahead, if I could. Who was that?
This is Brett in
Brett,
Dublin.
go ahead, please. I'm sorry, I can't see you, so please say your name.
With all due respect to the Cuban Doctors Program.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so if I could, with respect to the Cuban Doctor Program and to the other immigration policies, those were relics
the Cuban Adjustment
of
Act.
a very different kind of relationship.
Let him answer, John.
If we want to have a real opportunity for the Cuban people, we cannot say at the same time we are going to provide you with special treatment not afforded to people in any other country. We are going to normalize relations, and that comes at all levels. I don't think that continuing those programs was in the interest of the Cuban people.
So in terms of what happened with those doctors, though, excuse 1 second,
if I can respond.
In terms of what happened with those doctors, though, Brett, do you feel that the administration got it wrong? Do you feel that you made the wrong decision there? I mean, John Suarez clearly saying that doctors were being exploited in an horrific way. I'm sure you get lots of other cases. But do you feel, looking back with hindsight, you might have changed things? Brett?
Absolutely not. I interviewed those doctors at our embassy in Caracas when I was a consular official there. And while I certainly understand the impetus for the program, the reality is we are not going to fix Cuba by allowing more and more people to flee en masse, especially doctors out of Cuba. And what was driving the Obama administration's policy was saying, we need to have a new chapter, a chapter in which the Cuban government agrees to certain conditions, to taking steps to improve human rights. And the United States government is not going to continue policies that, as President Obama said, did not work for 50 years. We did not see an improvement in the human rights situation in Cuba over the course of 5 decades, and continuing those programs, I think, was going to be misguided.
Brett, thank you very much indeed. Word to all my guests. I will try to get you in as clearly and as quickly as I can, but because you're all from afar, it is difficult for me to actually sort of legislate for that, but I will do my best, and if you will bear with me, you'll all get your say. Thank you very much indeed for this first part of our France 24 debate. Stay with us, more coming up. Welcome back to the France 24 debate, part 2 of Cuba. After Castro, yes, Cuba preparing to hand over its leadership, but the post-Castro era, what will it bring? What will it change? There's some skepticism that it might mean any change at all. You can join this debate via the hashtag F24debate, and one such person has just done that, Xavier, or Javier, tweeting in with the Castro dictatorship may be history, but the future still looks bleak. With this new band of hand-picked officialists, there is one candidate nominated to be the president. That is Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez. We'll take a look at what he stands for in a moment. Let me bring to you first a run-through of our guests for this debate. We've already met 3 of them, starting with John Suarez, who is joining us from Miami. John Suarez, human rights activist at the Center for Free Cuba. John, thanks for staying with us. By satellite from Chicago, Illinois, Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez, who's a lecturer at Northwestern University and Latin America Director for Greenmantle. Good to see you still with us, Daniel. By Skype from Dublin, Brett Bruin, Director of Global Engagement for the Obama administration. He's been talking about the things that he went through then, and also now Latin America Director for Greenmantle. Excuse me, I got that wrong. And President of Global Situation Room. Excuse me, Brett, for misreading your title there. Joining us now by satellite from Havana in Cuba, I'm pleased to introduce to you Carlos Azulgaray, who's a Cuban diplomat and former ambassador of the Cuban mission to the European Union. Carlos, as you just joined us, I'll bring you in, sir, for your thoughts. As ever with these things, when you're live, you say you'll do one thing and something else happens. We can't go to Carlos. We'll bring him in very, very shortly. While we're sorting that out, let's take a look at the man who is the sole candidate to be Cuba's new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel Bermudez. A look at who he is, what he stands for.
Change is afoot in Cuba, and the communist island is about to get its first leader who didn't fight in the nation's 1950s revolution.
We are part of a generation that was born in the 60s. We greatly appreciate all the training and possibilities that the Cuban Revolution has given us. We have had the opportunity to participate in the management process from the base, in youth organizations as students.
For a man who holds the number 2 position to President Raul Castro, Miguel Diaz-Canel has kept a low profile in recent years. It wasn't always the case, though. An electronics engineer by training, he pushed for greater internet access for Cubans and garnered a reputation for pushing back against some of the more intolerant Communist Party policies. In particular, Diaz-Canel supported a cultural center that became a focus for the homosexual community in Villa Clara, the province he ran as party chief in the 1990s.
To support it at that time, when he came with a lot of innovative new ideas, like giving space to the LGBT community that was rather marginalized. Not by establishing a ghetto, but by integrating it into social and cultural life.
Diaz-Canel joined the Cuban government in 2009 as the Minister for Higher Education. He refrained from flashy showboating, something that had seen the careers of other politicians sunk, preferring to work in the background with a reputation as a man who got things done. It was in 2013 Diaz-Canel was named as vice president. He all but kept off the public stage entirely, towing the party line and earning praise from Cuba's revolutionary leaders for his solid ideological strength.
We are defending our process. We are defending the revolution that continues to be threatened, that continues to be attacked. In the midst of a complex global situation, in the midst, too, of a complex regional situation, all the while updating our economic and social model.
Diaz-Canel will face major economic and social challenges given the glacial pace of recent Cuban reforms, something he may have a freer rein to tackle once his mentor Raul Castro steps down from heading the Communist Party in 2021.
The man who will be president, Diaz-Canel there. Luke Schrager with that report. Let's bring in one of our guests for comments, starting with Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, who's joining us from Chicago. I'm hearing, Daniel, lots of positives. Do you hear those positives too?
Well, a reliable, if unfortunate, pattern of Latin American governments on both the left and right, honestly, is that they never waste an opportunity to waste an opportunity. The time to have been implementing a lot of these changes and do so credibly while still maintaining control would have been significantly easier around 2008 when Raul Castro came in, essentially, for his 5-year, or 2013, sorry, when he came in for his 5-year term, in part because during that time you had a credible case, at least regionally, for the left being a viable, or for leftist policies being viable in the long term. You had Hugo Chavez had just died, but Venezuela still seemed moderately stable economically. The PT was in power in Brazil. The Kirchners were, or at least a Kirchner was in power in Argentina. So you essentially had diplomatic cover, at least on a regional basis, and the argument that you could give to Cubans that this is a sustainable model internally was a little bit more credible. Right now, when you essentially have had a collapse of the left in pretty much the entire region, with few exceptions, and mainly those exceptions, countries like Ecuador, the left has remained nominally in place, but has moved to the right politically, Cuba finds itself very isolated and without a lot of partners that would be willing to help lubricate a transition, the type of transition that they want. Because the best case scenario for Cuba in this case is to be able to open up the markets locally somewhat, in certain areas, to be able to assure the wherewithal to keep social programs afloat, to maintain a modicum of credibility with their local population. Right now, it's very hard to get that done without having to give more than they're willing to give in terms of political control. What I see with the new president coming in, with Diaz-Canel, is that you have essentially what looks like a caretaker, a stopgap. He's coming in. He's a new face, significantly fresher than the ones we've seen at that level. But Raul Castro will remain in charge of the Communist Party, the only legal party in Cuba. So there's little chance that he won't be calling all the shots. And the ability to transition away from Canel Diaz is also significantly high, given the fact that his vice president is 85. Or is an 85-year-old. And on top of that, another potential candidate moving forward could be Raul Castro's son. So if they wanted to keep it a family business, and hereditary dictatorships are very hard to pull off historically, and to do them in a viable way, but Cuba has no small experience doing so. And the chances, I feel, of them not having a return to those roots in their quest to stay in power and stave off a potential reckoning were there to be a true transition in Cuba, and the crimes of the Cuban administration since the 60s be uncovered. Without having the G2 secret police making sure that all of those things stay hidden. I think that at the end of the day, that's something that they're not willing to risk departing from, at least not in the foreseeable future.
Daniel Landsberg, thank you. Stay with us, please. 50,000 dissident deaths from 1959, when Castro took power, Fidel Castro, till 2006. Please, John Suarez, over to you.
I'd like to respond in part to what was said in the last portion, which is this idea that there was a static policy for 50 years by the United States is not true. We've seen other occasions during the Carter administration, 1977, 1980, the Clinton administration during its 2 terms, and then again with the Obama administration. efforts to normalize relations. And I would argue that the Carter administration went the furthest in establishing the U.S. interest section, which operated as a de facto embassy until Obama renamed it an embassy. And secondly, in each of those cases, there was a disaster and there was a mass exodus of Cubans. The situation in the country worsened, and that led to a reversal of policy. During the Carter administration with Mariel and the fall of Nicaragua to the Sandinistas, with the Clinton administration, the Brothers to the Rescue shootdown where Americans were killed, with a worsening human rights situation, with another exodus, and with Venezuela rising, with Hugo Chavez, that Cuba played an important role in empowering him and making him a figure that could win that election that he did in 1998. Secondly, there's no mention about the role of China. When the Soviet Union imploded, China also played a role in assisting in Cuba and also setting up a base in the island there, and they continue to have a presence in Cuba. So I'd also like to say that we shouldn't ignore that. And lastly, with regards to the issue of the doctors and the Cuban Adjustment Act, that hasn't been the driver for a mass exodus out of Cuba. Typically, where we've seen those mass exoduses has been when administrations have sought to normalize relations with the regime, and that has coincided with Mariel, with the Rafter crisis, and then during the Obama administration, tens of thousands of Cubans leaving. Now, again, with the Trump administration, there's been a reduction, although there are still Cubans leaving on rafts. But to the issue of the doctors are still suing in places like Brazil and other countries, saying that they're being treated in slave-like conditions. This is not something that any other country in the hemisphere is doing. To pretend that Cuba is a normal regime like any other government in the hemisphere is false.
Cuba is not a normal regime, says John Suarez, among other things. Can I bring in Brett Bruin, please, from Dublin? Brett, over to you.
Yeah, I don't think anyone, including the Trump administration, believes that Cuba should be treated like any other country. That being said, let me, with all due respect to John, explain a little bit about how diplomacy and diplomatic negotiations work. You have to give something in order to get something. We achieved progress in Cuba during the Obama administration. We did so because we sat down at a table. We had negotiations. We told them what was expected. They told us what was going to be necessary in order to accomplish our overall goals. And I think we advanced the ball down the field a good way. We're not getting to the end zone. No one is spiking the ball and claiming victory here. That being said, what President Obama accomplished in opening up a new chapter, I think, was important. I also have to say, just bringing it back up to the present day, this transition, while it is certainly not ideal, while it certainly does not represent a fundamental shift in how Havana is going to operate, nonetheless, I think has to be seen as a moment, a juncture at which the world can decide how do we want to try to engage. And if they are smart about it, and I think particularly leaders here in Europe, if they want to try to bring the Trump administration back into the fold in engaging in a constructive way towards a solution that is going to improve the human rights of the people of Cuba, this is the moment to start.
Indeed, a shift has to happen. Sir, that has to happen between people who want to go to the same place. John Suarez, to you.
I'd like to respond quickly, which is I don't see what progress was made. You had a situation where you had an embassy operating with a full staff for decades that is now basically shuttered after attacks began occurring against U.S. diplomats in November of 2016 under the Obama administration. You have a shuttered embassy. You also have Canadians now having to be removing their loved ones because the situation has gotten worse. You have a situation where the Obama administration was distancing itself from dissidents. It was a case of Rosa Maria Payá being threatened by the spokesperson at the State Department not to raise her hand or ask a question because the Cuban foreign minister was there. It was a chilling effect. It sent a message to the Castro regime, which allowed them to kidnap Alan Gross in 2010. When the U.S. did not respond in a forceful manner, preferring to continue diplomacy, we saw high-profile dissidents, beginning with Orlando Zapata Tamayo, a prisoner of conscience, die in 2010. The leader of the Ladies in White, Lara Poyan, in 2011, died under suspicious circumstances. Nothing was done. The drive for normalization continued, and we saw Osvaldo Payá Sardinas killed in July of 2012 with his youth leader. These were people that could have overseen a democratic transition in Cuba. They're gone now because the regime understood that they did not face consequences for eliminating them. And what is taking place in Cuba today is not a transition, sir. It's a succession. And it's a succession with the aim of preserving the Castro dynasty. Let's
John,
not
I don't think
ourselves.
anybody is doubting that one in this debate at all. John Suarez, human rights activist from the Center for a Free Cuba. Thank you, sir. We now have a connection established to Havana in Cuba. Carlos Alzugaray is waiting for us, Cuban diplomat and former ambassador of the Cuban mission to the European Union. Carlos, thank you for joining us. We've heard from our guests an amount of skepticism that there's going to be any change in Cuba, that life is going to change at all under a new president. And I think the general consensus here is that this is just a succession, what we're seeing. There's nothing democratic going on. It's a continuation of effectively of Castro rule. In terms of where you are, in terms of what you are hoping for, what your hopes, aspirations are, what are you hoping will come of what is happening right now in your country?
Well, I think that vision that you presented is not exactly what's happening. There have been changes in Cuba over the last 10 years, very important changes in terms of economics, the opening of the private sector, the accession of Cubans to internet, the approval of owning cell phones, the migration reform from 2013 that allows all Cubans to travel freely outside Cuba. So changes have been happening, and those changes are going to continue happening. What is happening now is basically a transition or a transformation of the Cuban leadership from the historic leadership of the Cuban Revolution to a younger generation that has been promoted democratically. Don't forget this. Cuba had elections in March. We are now having consultations, and finally a new leader has been chosen. It is not the type of democracy that exists in some other places, but it's a type of democracy.
In terms of what the people can have, Carlos, in terms of what the people can do, will they get more freedom?
Of course, we are very free since we had the revolution. Remember, we had a dictatorship before 1959, which we were not free. So we have been free for a long time. There have been restrictions to certain things because of the war that has been happening between Cuba and the United States. But you know, I am a person who can tell my mind. I can say it. I use different media to do it. So I don't know why you insist so much in saying that there's no freedom in Cuba.
There's a whole list of dissidents that we could quote. There's a whole series of incidents that clearly raise questions about the issue of freedom in Cuba.
Well, all these dissidents are free. And they, for example, Joanny Sanchez, Rodiles comes in and out, Rosa Maria Payat comes in and out of Cuba. So the presentation like there is no freedom is quite out of the question.
And in terms of what Diaz-Canel can do for your country, he seems to be, by the standards that we've come accustomed to be a very liberal character. Do you expect a liberalization of Cuba?
Well, the liberalization began, and this is, you know, this is a problem of perspective. You're looking at Cuba as if it were a dictatorship before. It was a dictatorship before 1959. So there has been a constant liberalization of the process. Of course, there have been, as I said before, there have been restrictions in the past, but those restrictions have been eliminated little by little, and those restrictions were caused by certain historical conditions. So we are moving away from those restrictions, and the country is more democratic today than it was 60 years ago.
But critics are saying that it's still a dictatorship, Carlos.
I don't classify Cuba as a dictatorship. I have lived in dictatorships, and Cuba is not a dictatorship.
How do you hope your country will change when your new president, who we know who he is, we know it's going to be Diaz-Canel, when he's elected, when he's confirmed, how do you hope your country will change?
It will change in the following ways. There is a more, let's say, deliberative process of democracy going on in Cuba. Most of the documents that design the future of Cuba have been discussed by every Cuban. Every Cuban has had the opportunity of making its contribution. Those documents were finally approved by the National Assembly recently, and this is the basic where we're going. What are we doing? In the economic field, we are expanding the private sector, reforming the state sector to become more decentralized, more efficient, and then on the other hand, there are in place constitutional reform processes that will take place over the next 2 or 3 years. I would like some differences in the way that we elect our leaders, but that will come eventually. I don't believe that we're going to see something else.
Carlos, thank you for your time. Thank you for being so frank with us. John Suarez, are you convinced?
No, it is true that Cuba was a dictatorship prior to 1959. It was an authoritarian dictatorship that had overthrown a democratic order on March 10th of 1952. But the revolution that was carried out in the late 50s, not only by Fidel Castro's July 26 movement, but other groups, was to restore the democratic order. Fidel Castro himself in 1961, after consolidating communist rule in Cuba, explained why he had lied to Cubans throughout the late 1950s. And I'm going to quote here. If we had paused to tell the people that we were Marxist-Leninists while we were on Pico Turquino and not yet strong, it is possible that we would have never been able to descend to the plains. He understood that if he had told people what he was planning to do, instead of starting up the firing squads and imposing terror, he would not have had the opportunity to implant the Marxist-Leninist dictatorship that has been maintained in Cuba for the past...
John, let me pause you now and give Carlos a chance to reply to that. Carlos, a quick reply to that, if you could, please.
This is a stereotype. This is a caricature of what happened. What happened in 1959 was not the firing squads. The firing squad had to happen because during the Batista dictatorship, a lot of people had been killed and justice had to be done. What was most important in 1959 was first the end of corruption. The corrupt system was eliminated. And then secondly, a number of reforms, the land reform, the urban reform, the health reform, the educational reform. The Cuban Revolution brought reading and writing for 45% of the population who didn't know how to read and write. Those were important reforms. Now, when you give culture and education to people, you are not imposing a dictatorship, you are giving more possibilities for freedom. So I think this is a caricature. What this person has presented is a caricature of what happened in the early years of the revolution.
Carlos, thank you. Daniel Landsberg.
Yes, if I can respond to Carlos.
Go ahead, please.
As well. I teach a unit to my students on propaganda. And one of the things that I always tell them is that when you are trying to get information from government propaganda, there is often much more in what is left out than what is said. In hearing the discussion as to, or the argument of why Cuba isn't a dictatorship, what was left out was that in the elections that were just held, all of the candidates were nominated by pro-government organizations.
And there's only one candidate.
Where rising to leadership within those organizations is predicated on basically subjective definitions by the central government and the Politburo of who is a patriot, who is with the process, and who is not. So yes, you can essentially choose
Daniel,
between a carefully vetted set of
We're getting the message. Let me pause you, Daniel. Let's get a comment from Brett, and then I'll go back to Carlos for his final thought. Brett, over to you.
That simply is not true.
I think in just...
Carlos, I'll bring you in a second. Please wait, Carlos.
It is really important that we...
Brett,
go
ahead.
This was not true. I mean, you're saying things that are not true.
Carlos, please wait. I will let you reply in a second. Please wait, Carlos. Carlos, please wait. Brett, over to you, quickly.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brett.
Okay.
I think in terms of providing some perspective here, it is less useful for us to spend our time debating what happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago. It's more important for us to focus on how are we going forward. And I think in order to go forward, we have to, as President Obama did, look for opportunities for us to find common ground, to fix what clearly are a number of human rights and other issues that exist. But we're not going to do it by standing on top of the mountain and shouting louder and refusing to come down and talk.
Agreed. And we do need to learn from history, don't we, as well, which is important.
We have clearly a new leader who's taking over, and it is worth trying to have that discussion. It is worth testing out their commitment to this path.
Let's get Carlos's final thought. Carlos, over to you, sir.
Well, that's a view that is totally... I live here. I participated in the electoral process. I went to my township meeting. I proposed the candidates. I voted for them. 300 of the members of the National Assembly were elected at the grassroots level. On the other hand, I participate in a project called Último Jueves de Temas. Every last Thursday of every month, we have a debate on public issues in a public place with free attendance.
And people can talk.
Come on, let's be serious about this debate.
And Carlos, people can talk. People can have their say.
Yeah, what?
I agree that we should be serious.
Carlos, I'm saying, and people can openly speak and have their say. They can speak their mind.
Of course, of course. I have been in a meeting in Último Jueves where a guy said, this is a dictatorship. Nothing happened. He was not arrested. He was not booed down. People heard him, and he made his arguments. That's it.
Carlos Azúcar, thank you very much indeed, sir.
Come on.
Carlos,
I live here.
Carlos, thank you very much for joining us. We wait to see what happens. We know it's going to happen. Miguel Mario Diaz-Canel Barús will be confirmed as president eventually the process is done. Thanks to our guests, Carlos Azúcar, Brett Bruin in Dublin, Daniel Lansberg Rodriguez joining us from Chicago, and John Suarez in Miami, Florida, joining us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for being with us. Thanks for your contributions. Thanks for your forbearance with our technical issues and allowing people to talk when their turn came up. And thank you for watching this debate. We have a very short media watch next.